Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something darker than you might expect. Not horror, not true crime, just history. The real, unfiltered, suffocating kind that makes you realize your worst Monday is someone else's entire existence. We're talking about 4 lives that sound romantic on paper. Medieval peasant, Russian empress, Maya queen, Mexican artist. But strip away the Hollywood polish and you're left with lice, political assassinations, ritual sacrifice, and chronic pain that never, ever stops. So before we begin, if you're enjoying this kind of content, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe only if you actually want more. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing who's out there in the dark with me. Now settle in. Maybe dim the lights. Let that background hum of your fan or heater remind you how good you have it. Because tonight, we're stepping into 4 lives you absolutely would not survive. Part 1. Medieval Peasant. Welcome to Hell on Earth. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress that smells like a barn floor. Because it was a barn floor 3 months ago. No memory foam, no pillows, just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter and weighs as much as a small cow from accumulated grime. The church bell clangs in the distance. It's your alarm clock, only louder and infinitely less merciful. Your home? A wooden hut. 1 room, no windows. An open concept floor plan where your family, livestock, and a small army of domestic insects all share the same space. The smell is a symphony. Stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you pray isn't mold. But deep down, you know it is. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it. The air is freezing. Your joints ache. You're 22 years old, which in medieval terms is middle-aged. Your spine cracks like an old wooden door. Your knees sound like a bag of rocks being shaken. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either wet from last night's rain, leaking through the thatched roof, or crusty from something your neighbor's chicken did. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. Privacy? What's that? Your entire family, and maybe a cousin who just never left, are waking up beside you. No bedroom, no curtains, no me time, just communal everything. Welcome to Mording in medieval Europe, where you're never truly alone, because parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always with you. And this is just the start. Nature calls. And it's not asking politely. Here's where you really start missing modern plumbing. There's no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, not even a plunger. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an adventure, a social experiment, and often a public event. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is a wooden bucket behind the house. It's already full because Uncle Wolfstan had a rough night with bad turnips. The smell is biblical. You do your business, then, here's the kicker, you toss it into the street. Yes, the street. You're supposed to shout, "Gardez-loo," Old French for "watch out below," before dumping it out the window. Although frankly, no one ever moves fast enough. Medieval streets are open sewers, a charming river of human waste, animal droppings, and mystery liquids you'd rather not examine. If you live in a town with public latrines, congratulations. You get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is a myth and ventilation is a cruel joke. Toilet paper? Never heard of it. Most people wipe with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or, if they're feeling fancy, a scrap of wool. Sometimes, nothing at all. Which might explain why handshakes weren't popular yet. And if you're in a castle, surely it's better, right? Sort of. You might have a guard robe, a hole in the wall that drops raced directly into the moat. Great idea, except your enemies know this. And yes, attackers sometimes climbed in through the waste chute. Talk about entering through the back door. So whether you're a farmer or a baron, medieval toileting is a humiliation ritual. It's cold, public, dangerous, and never not disgusting. One slip on a wet stone path, and you're face first in humanity's leftovers. And you still haven't brushed your teeth. You survived the toilet. Surely you deserve a reward. A nice breakfast, something warm and comforting. Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Nothing is comforting here. Breakfast is a grim affair. No eggs Benedict, no coffee, certainly no avocado toast. You sit near the fire with a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off a muddy boot. Welcome to pottage, a thick, gloopy stew made of whatever you can find. Grains, root vegetables, maybe beans if you're lucky. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks. New ingredients just dumped on top of the old. It's less a recipe, more an ongoing edible experiment. On the side, a hunk of bread so hard it could deflect arrows. Made from coarse rye or barley, often bulked up with sawdust, ground acorns, or other creative ingredients, because wheat is a rich man's fantasy. This loaf is not your friend. You don't slice it. You negotiate with it. Drinks? You're not sipping orange juice. You're drinking beer at 6 a.m. Why? Because the water is teeming with parasites and filth. So you start your day with weak ale, low alcohol, high survivability. Kids drink it too. No one's happy about it, but at least it won't kill you immediately. Want meat or cheese? Dream on. That's for Sundays and saints' feast days, and only if your lord is feeling generous. Most peasants don't eat meat more than a few times a year. Fresh fruit? Only in season, and usually fermented into wine. Spices? Unless you're royalty, forget it. A pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wages. So you chew your gritty bread, gulp your medieval beer, and try not to think about the rat that may have nibbled your porridge in the night. Breakfast doesn't energize you. It just happens to you. And now that you're properly underfed, it's time to work like your life depends on it. Because it does. Time to head to work. Except there's no office, no desk, no coffee break, and no chance of promotion. Your job, if you're like 90% of the population, is simple. Don't die while laboring for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. Congratulations. That means you work land that belongs to a lord, who probably doesn't remember your name. You rise with the sun and stop only when it disappears behind the trees. Your tools? A wooden hoe, a rusty sickle. Whatever bones are still intact in your body. There's no weekend, no clocking out, just sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Sunday is off, but only if you're not harvesting, fighting off raiders, or praying feverishly for your infected toe to stop turning black. The work is brutal, Fields are plowed by hand or with oxen if you're rich enough. You dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds, carry water until your spine begins to resemble the letter S. If you're a woman, surprise, you don't just do field work. You also care for children, clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, and pretend your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly migrating to your side of the bed. Children start helping around age 5. No school, no toys, just a tiny wooden rake and a dream of one day not dying of the flu. Break a bone? Too bad. Get a fever? Drink some warm beer and keep going. You can't afford to stop, not even for a day, because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, medieval Europe has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. If you're alive past 40, you're practically a celebrity. You might even be called the Old One, which is less a nickname, more a statistical miracle. Average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years, but that number is dragged down by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before age 5. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood already exhausted. By 25, your joints creaked. You might be missing teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. For women, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death. No pain relief, no medical intervention, just prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot. For men, the dangers were different but equally relentless. Farming accidents, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage. Even walking to the market could be risky. Death could come quietly, from plague, famine, or bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating. Funerals? You were lucky if you got one. Bodies were buried quickly to avoid disease. No embalming, no polished coffins. Just a hole, a few prayers, and a shallow mound of earth. In medieval times, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death. You didn't retire. You just stopped showing up. Part 2. Catherine the Great. The foreigner who seized an empire. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, she was simply Sophie. Born in 1729, Sophie Frederica Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst was the daughter of a relatively obscure German princely family. Her tiny duchy offered little power, but Sophie had something no title could provide: razor-sharp intelligence, relentless charm, and a quiet, burning hunger for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and calculating, a social climber obsessed with status. Sophie's father was distant. From a young age, Sophie learned to walk the fine line between obedience and cunning. She read voraciously, spoke multiple languages, learned how to observe a room before speaking in it, skills that would soon become survival tools in one of Europe's most brutal courts. When Russian Empress Elizabeth began searching for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Sophie fit the bill perfectly. Noble blood, Lutheran faith, which she'd be forced to abandon, a reputation for grace and humility. At just 14, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in freezing St. Petersburg, wearing thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her mother pushed her forward like a chess piece, but Sophie had her own game in mind. To become acceptable, she converted to Orthodoxy, taking the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. The ceremony was public, symbolic, life-altering. She wasn't just changing religions. She was burning the bridge behind her, stepping into a foreign empire with no way back. No one watching that quiet teenage girl could have predicted what would come next. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. From the moment Sophie stepped foot in the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began planning how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was meant to secure her place in Russian royalty, but from the beginning it felt more like a cage than a crown. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was not a dashing prince. Awkward, immature, obsessed with toy soldiers. He was more interested in playing war games than governing an empire, or showing affection to his wife. Some accounts suggest he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and resented the Russian court. In contrast, Catherine embraced Russia with fierce determination. She learned the language, studied its history, memorized Orthodox rituals. She wanted to belong. Peter wanted to escape. This wasn't just an emotional mismatch, it was political. The Russian court was a viper's nest of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games. Catherine was watched constantly. Her letters were read, her friendships monitored, her every move scrutinized. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother, or even her servants. But Catherine was no fool. She learned to play the court's games, quietly cultivating allies, charming military officers, making friends with scholars. She developed a reputation for dignity and restraint, a stark contrast to Peter's childish tantrums and open contempt for Russian traditions. Behind closed doors, Catherine began reading Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. While others saw her as a young consort, she was building a vision, not just for herself, but for Russia, a nation of strength, education, and reason. But there was one problem. The longer Peter lived, the longer Catherine remained in limbo, a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, observed, and planned. She knew the Russian throne wouldn't be inherited. It would have to be taken. In 1762, after nearly 2 decades of waiting, Catherine saw her moment and seized it with breathtaking precision. Empress Elizabeth had died, and Peter, now Peter III, was finally Tsar. But his reign unraveled almost immediately. In just a few months, Peter alienated the church, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and lavished praise on Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy. He reversed key policies, humiliated the clergy, and talked openly about divorcing Catherine to marry his mistress. The court turned cold. The army grumbled. Even ordinary Russians saw Peter as a foreign puppet who mocked their traditions. Catherine, watching all of this unfold, made her move. In July 1762, while Peter was at his summer palace, Catherine launched a bloodless coup d'etat, supported by key military officers, including her lover Gregory Orlov and his brothers. She rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Catherine II, and won the allegiance of the powerful imperial guard. Peter, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, a hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, murder. Catherine was now empress, not by birth, not by marriage, but by will, wit, and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had taken the Russian throne without a single battle. But her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without falling victim to the same fate as her husband? Catherine understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a visionary. And so began her transformation, from careful conspirator to reforming empress, one who would redraw borders, embrace the Enlightenment, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Catherine had the crown, she could have rested. But she didn't. She had something bigger in mind than simply sitting on a throne. She wanted to transform Russia, not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Peter had worshipped toy soldiers, Catherine idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people, even if she herself ruled with absolute authority. Catherine didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy. She lived it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years. She invited Diderot to her court, and even purchased his entire library to support him financially. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to codify Russian law. She formed the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious project intended to rewrite the entire legal code. Catherine's own nakaz, instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise, speaking of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in the 18th century Russia, it was radical. But Enlightenment ideals had to survive the realities of Russia, a vast, feudal, deeply conservative land, ruled by nobles who liked their serfs exactly where they were, beneath them. Catherine knew this. While she advocated reform, she moved carefully. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to keep them loyal. This was Catherine's balancing act. A philosopher queen in public, a practical empress in private. She walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between the shining salons of Paris and the gritty politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make Russia modern, on her terms. And that meant reform, yes, but with an iron hand in a velvet glove. Catherine wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward, to make it an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars not just to defend her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought throughout the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about territory. They were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russia captured key regions, including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something Russian czars had coveted for generations. These victories weren't just military. They were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer the distant, backward cousin of Europe. It was a continental force. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of deals and diplomatic maneuvers, Catherine participated in the partitions of Poland, carving up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, along with Austria and Prussia. By the end of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland was erased from the map. Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't just conquer with armies. She colonized with ideas. New cities were built. Trade routes expanded. German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a mosaic, from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. And through it all, Catherine remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, personally overseeing the shape of her expanding empire. Critics accused her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, expansion wasn't ambition. It was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by ideas, but by borders. For all her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great was just as famous for what went on behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully curated parade of them. Many decades younger, often handsome, sometimes politically influential. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important was Gregory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin wasn't just a lover. He was her co-ruler in many ways. Still, Europe couldn't look past the scandal. Gossip swirled. Satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. And after her death, the rumors only got worse. The most infamous being a completely false and grotesque tale involving a horse, spread by her enemies to smear her legacy. But why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who wielded power unapologetically. And in a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms. And that made her dangerous. Ironically, while her critics painted her as immoral, Catherine herself was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed pleasure was a natural part of life, and that personal relationships didn't have to threaten public responsibility. She separated emotion from governance, a feat few male rulers managed. In reality, her liaisons were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically useful. And when they ceased to be, she let them go, usually with a smile and a generous retirement. Catherine's love life didn't weaken her rule. It was part of her strategy, a blend of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared. For all her charisma and control, Catherine's reign was not without peril. And in 1773, that peril came in the form of a bearded Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev. He was no ordinary rebel. Pugachev claimed to be none other than Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. According to him, he had survived the coup and now returned to reclaim the throne from the German usurper. It was absurd. Peter was long gone. But to Russia's oppressed and exhausted lower classes, the claim didn't need to be true. It just needed to offer hope. Pugachev promised liberation, an end to serfdom, lower taxes, land for the common people. His words lit a fire across the Volga River region, especially among Cossacks, peasants, and old believers. In a time when the gap between nobles and serfs had widened brutally, his promises sounded like salvation. The Pugachev Rebellion became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were taken, fortresses fell. Nobles were slaughtered. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the empire itself might fracture. Catherine was shaken. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt from within, her own people, rising against the system she ruled. But Catherine didn't panic. She acted. She dispatched professional military forces to crush the rebellion ruthlessly. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and eventually beheaded in Moscow, a public warning to all who dared follow. Afterward, Catherine doubled down on order and control. Her dreams of liberating the serfs quietly faded into silence. The rebellion had shown her the limits of enlightenment in a country still shackled by feudalism. She now leaned harder on the nobility, who offered loyalty in exchange for absolute control over their serfs. This was a turning point. The empress who once quoted Voltaire now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reform became cautious. Surveillance increased. Rebellion, even whispered, was to be stomped out before it had breath. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a warning that haunted Catherine. That power built on inequality could only hold so long before the storm came crashing through. By the time Catherine approached the final years of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 3 decades, longer than any female ruler in Russian history. From the moment she seized power, she had defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under Catherine's reign, Russia became a true European powerhouse. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, swallowing Crimea, parts of Poland, and stretches of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just military wins. They were strategic pivots, securing warm water ports and reshaping trade. But her legacy wasn't only drawn on maps. Catherine left a cultural mark as well. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe, and corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment. Her court became a center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often viewed as backward by Western Europeans, Catherine put Russia firmly on the cultural map. She modernized education, founding schools for girls, and promoting the printing of books. She introduced smallpox inoculation to Russia, even publicly receiving the vaccine herself, an act of scientific bravery in her time. Yet her reign was also one of contradictions. While she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never freed the serfs. In fact, she extended serfdom deeper into Russia's territories. Her reforms, while impressive, remained mostly top-down, designed to polish the empire without truly transforming its foundations. Still, Catherine's rule brought stability and ambition. She understood that power was not inherited. It was crafted, managed, and constantly defended. She ruled not by divine right, but by force of will, political brilliance, and relentless calculation. She was called many things: a usurper, a tyrant, a reformer, a seductress. But above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a throne secure, an empire expanded, and a legend that would endure for centuries. Part 3. The Red Queen of Palenque. Mystery wrapped in crimson. In the humid depths of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, the ruins of Palenque whisper stories from the ancient Maya world. Towering temples rise above the canopy, their limestone faces eroded by time but still brimming with secrets. And in 1994, one of those secrets revealed itself. A team of Mexican archaeologists, led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, was surveying Temple 13, a relatively modest pyramid next to the more famous Temple of the Inscriptions, the burial site of the mighty King Pakal the Great. Temple 13 wasn't expected to hold much, until they noticed something odd. A sealed, hidden chamber beneath the structure. No looters had touched it. It was pristine. When the archaeologists broke through and lowered themselves inside, they found a stone sarcophagus resting in silence. The air was heavy with the weight of centuries. As they opened the lid, red dust rose like smoke. Brilliant, shocking red. The interior was covered in powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide used ceremonially by the Maya, and lying within that crimson cloud was the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care and reverence. Her bones were fragile but intact. Her skull still wore a jade mask. Her body was surrounded by funerary offerings, necklaces, diadems, ear spools, all crafted from jade and shell. Everything about the burial screamed royalty, yet no name was inscribed. No glyphs identified her. It was one of the richest female burials ever found in Mesoamerica, and yet it was a total enigma. Why was she buried in red powder? Who was she? Was she a queen, a priestess, or perhaps even Pocahontas' wife? The researchers called her the Red Queen, and the name stuck. But even with modern forensics, they couldn't say for sure who she was. Only that she had lived around the 7th century, during the golden age of Palenque. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers had been hidden, untouched, and purposefully isolated. Her burial wasn't just ceremonial. It was spiritual. This woman wasn't meant to be remembered with words. She was meant to be remembered through ritual, through color, and through the mystery she left behind. The most haunting feature of the Red Queen's tomb wasn't her jade jewelry or the silence of the sealed chamber. It was the red dust. A thick layer of powdered cinnabar covered everything: the sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, even the offerings around her. It clung like blood to stone. To the Maya, this was no accident. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was one of the most sacred and dangerous substances in the ancient world. Its vibrant red color wasn't just visually striking. It symbolized blood, rebirth, and the life force that connected the human and divine realms. Red was sacred. It was the color of sunrise, of sacrifice, of life emerging from death. And it wasn't just symbolic, it was spiritual. Covering the dead in cinnabar was a ritual meant to transform the body, preserving it not for eternity, but for transition. In Maya belief, death wasn't the end. It was a passage, a crossing into another cosmic layer. And so the Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared not just for burial, but for deification. But there's another layer to this. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can lead to mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, even death. The Maya likely didn't understand the chemistry, but they felt its potency. It was volatile, powerful, dangerous. To bathe a corpse in it was to declare this person was no ordinary mortal. In Palenque, very few were buried with cinnabar. Pakal the Great, the mighty king whose pyramid dominates the site, was one. His body, like hers, was also saturated in the red powder. That detail alone drew speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal divine status? Her skull had been placed on a layer of jaguar skin, another sacred symbol. Around her, bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines hinted at rituals performed either during her life or in her honor at death. Every part of her burial told a story without words, a story of power, cloaked in secrecy. A woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony, drenched in the color of sacrifice. For all the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one haunting void. No name, no inscriptions adorned her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls identified her. She was clearly someone powerful. But who? From the moment her tomb was opened, scholars began trying to connect the dots. The most compelling theory? That the Red Queen was Zakbu Ajah, the wife of Kinich Janab Pakal, known today as Pakal the Great, the most famous ruler of Palenque. Zakbu Ajah was more than just Pakal's consort. She was born into nobility and married into Palenque's royal dynasty at a young age. She bore at least 3 sons, all of whom held high status, and she played a key ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone could be buried with such honor, it was her. Supporting this theory was the tomb's location, just a few feet away from Pakal's own grand burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions. The proximity suggests a deliberate pairing, husband and wife, rulers, even in death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palenque were found with such intense cinnabar coverage, Pakal and the Red Queen. It's unlikely this was coincidence. But here's where the mystery deepens. DNA tests were conducted on both sets of remains in hopes of confirming the connection, but the results? Inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to Picard, but that didn't rule out a spousal relationship. After all, marriage doesn't require shared blood. Some have argued she could have been Sak Cook, Pukal's powerful mother, who ruled Palenque before he came of age. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost to history's erosion. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Zakbu Ajah, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to Pokah. The lack of a name may not be an oversight. It may have been intentional. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on not through monuments, but through ritual, symbol, and the whispers of the earth. And so the Red Queen remained suspended between legend and truth. A woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from. A world where Maya women, especially royal ones, held more influence than many realize. In Maya civilization, politics was often a family affair. Royal women weren't merely passive consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, and power brokers. They conducted rituals, sponsored temples, and played crucial roles in maintaining dynastic legitimacy. Their bloodlines were political capital, used to forge alliances and secure claims to the throne. Take Sakok, for example, the mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne of Palenque was left vacant, she took power herself and ruled as queen regent until her son came of age. She wasn't a placeholder. She was a ruler in her own right, issuing decrees and overseeing construction projects. Without her, the Kala may never have risen at all, and she wasn't an anomaly. Across the Maya world, in places like Yaxchilan, Naran-O, and Chelakmu, inscriptions show women performing major ceremonies, engaging in warfare diplomacy, and sometimes ruling outright. They were often portrayed in stelae and murals dressed in elaborate headdresses and regalia, standing beside kings as equals, or sometimes above them. Their words were carved in glyphs. Their names were remembered, until they weren't. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, much of that memory had eroded. The colonial lens saw native women as silent figures in a male-dominated world. But the archaeology tells a different story, one of complex gender roles where power was negotiated, not simply inherited. This context casts the Red Queen in a new light. She may not have ruled in name, but her burial, rich, sacred, and positioned beside Pikal, suggests she was a central pillar in the royal order. Her jade mask wasn't just decoration. It was a symbol of identity, of power held in life and protected in death. Her bloodline may have been the very glue that held Palenque's dynasty together. In Maya civilization, a queen wasn't just a queen. She was a keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in ceremony, and often the bridge between gods and men. The Red Queen may be nameless, but in her world, she was never voiceless. To the ancient Maya, death wasn't the end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld known as Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this crossing was not only spiritual, it was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. Burial rituals were carefully choreographed events, rooted in myth, and meant to guide the soul through the treacherous layers of the underworld. Maya texts and iconography tell us that Xibalba was no peaceful afterlife. It was a maze of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and gods of death. Only those properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could make the journey successfully. The Red Queen was buried wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings, all signs of an elite burial. But there's more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hint at auto-sacrifice rituals, possibly symbolic tools representing rites she had performed in life, or that were reenacted at her burial to empower her spirit. Her funerary mask, carefully assembled from jade tiles, was not simply decorative. It may have served as a spiritual vessel, preserving her face and identity as she journeyed into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was a mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels surrounding her may have once held chocolate, maize, water, or even pulque to nourish her in the next world. Other items, like stingray spines or shell trumpets, could have represented spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or tokens of ritual communication. Burial wasn't just a goodbye. It was a transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as earthly incarnations of gods, and in death, they returned to those divine origins. The Red Queen, covered in the color of blood, entombed in a pyramid, and honored with offerings, was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a being tied to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her legend. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque endures, not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most enigmatic and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, now whispers across centuries, inviting questions that echo louder with every discovery. She represents a mystery that still resists full understanding. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph carved her name. No stela told her story. And yet the care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, the symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones, all speak of a woman profoundly important. Not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to reevaluate assumptions. She's a reminder that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent. They led rituals, governed cities, and shaped dynasties. While kings like Pakal have long taken the spotlight, the Red Queen's reemergence reminds us that power did not belong to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasures she left behind. It's the conversation she started. Among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers, every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in Temple 13 tells us something deliberate. This woman mattered. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of her story. Not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a living puzzle, a shared human longing to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now stares back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but not voiceless. Mysterious, but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. And still, somehow, she speaks. Part 4. Frida Kahlo, the artist who painted pain into power. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the vibrant district of Coyoacán, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, the Blue House, was filled with color, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battleground, and a museum to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of 4 daughters, born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderon, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were opposites. Guillermo, reserved and intellectual. Matilda, religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and bold. She read voraciously and asked questions most adults didn't want to answer. But at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other. A physical difference she tried to mask with long skirts, but never allowed to limit her spirit. The illness left her bedridden for months and isolated from other children. During this time, she grew close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and stay mentally sharp. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida didn't aspire to become a wife or homemaker. Her goal? To become a doctor. She enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at age 15, one of only a handful of girls accepted. There she stood out not just for her intelligence, but for her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and unique sense of style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as the Cachuches, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that challenged tradition. But even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body, and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world with sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity too big to fit inside anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán. She was preparing to remake herself entirely. On September 17th, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was split in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, after school. They were laughing, teasing each other, and probably arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. But moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant, her future unraveled into pain, metal, and silence. The crash was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and flinging passengers. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in 3 places. Her right leg shattered. Her foot dislocated. Her collarbone and ribs broke. Her shoulder dislocated. Her abdomen pierced. She was just 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed overcoat. Someone else noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had exploded on impact, dusting her broken form in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital and underwent numerous surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, immobile, writhing with infection and uncertainty. The future she'd imagined, of becoming a doctor, slipped further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to stir. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother rigged a special easel to hang above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and agony, Frida began to paint. First out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection, because she was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity, it was survival. The crash had broken her physically, but it had also opened a door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay encased in plaster and steel, a body fighting itself with every breath, she began to paint. What started as a form of therapy soon became a language, and that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often hard to look at. Which was precisely the point. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain. Her pain. Physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits. Not because she was vain, but because, as she famously said, "I paint myself because I'm so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her early works were small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas. Her emotions became the altar. She painted herself as split, as pierced, as bleeding. In one painting, she is impaled by nails like a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats in a barren landscape, tethered to a broken column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated, and bare, but never passive, always watching. Her pain was not sanitized. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story. She was inventing a new kind of visual narrative, one that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she recovered enough to walk again, albeit painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain. She made the world look at it. And in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and just 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most profound and turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior, already Mexico's most famous painter. Massive in both stature and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it, but now she wanted his opinion of her work. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his scaffolded work to ask bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and said, "Yes." And not just out of kindness. He recognized in her something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and unpretentious, full of rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship that was as consuming as it was creative. Frida once said, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929, an odd pairing to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, politically famous. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter, but he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Christina. Frida was devastated, and in return she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later, with different terms. This time, Frida would keep her autonomy, her home, her money, her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her, he wounded her, but he also believed in her as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine what painting could be. Together, they were not peaceful. but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida followed Diego on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face to face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, and they left her with deep political discomfort. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with appearances. She missed the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style solidified, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida didn't just paint herself for vanity. She painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her body constantly in pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portraits showed her bleeding, fragmented, exposed. Yet her face was always calm, always direct, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss: a fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotional, a canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tehuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not just as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology all intertwined in her work. While Rivera was painting murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost: the body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self always staring back. In exile and in illness, she became not just a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. As the 1940s wore on, Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often in grueling succession. At times, she was bedridden for months, encased in body casts, or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart. But still, she painted. Each canvas during these years became both a release and an act of resistance. Her works grew darker, more defiant. She painted with a clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In The Broken Column, she presents herself, split down the middle, her body pierced with nails, a cracked ionic column replacing her spine. Yet her face is stoic, her gaze unflinching. Pain for Frida was no longer just a subject. It was her companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political voice also grew louder. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote fiery letters, and called out imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she appeared at protests in a wheelchair, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was given her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile, doctors told her she couldn't attend. So she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed. Dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her own work, she greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both childlike and harrowing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset, cradled by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece bearing the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always sun with life. On July 13th, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same place she had been born, La Casa Azul in Coyoacán. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted by pain, by surgeries, by the long war with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA coup in Guatemala. Weak and wheelchair-bound, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised in the air. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was brief but piercing. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even as his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was whispered only in art circles. Her works weren't easy to categorize, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance began to resonate. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She was a symbol of pain turned into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, unibrow, gaze, flowers in her hair, became iconic. Her home became a museum. Her diary became a sacred text. And her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow, but in death, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind paintings. She left behind a mirror and dared us all to look. Not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. So there you have it. 4 lives that sound romantic on paper, but were actually exercises in endurance, pain, and sheer will. A medieval peasant who woke up every day in filth and fought just to survive until nightfall. Catherine the Great, a foreign teenager who seized an empire through cunning, courage, and ruthless calculation. The Red Queen of Palenque, a woman so powerful she was buried in crimson and mystery, yet history forgot to write down her name. And Frida Kahlo, who turned a broken body into a canvas and pain into one of the most recognized artistic voices of the 20th century. None of them had it easy. None of them lived the fairy tale. But they all survived in ways most of us never will, because they had to. And maybe that's the point. We romanticize the past. We look at empresses and artists and ancient queens and think, how beautiful, how powerful, how free. But scratch the surface and you find lice, political coups, toxic burial rituals, and chronic pain that never stops. Still, they endured. They resisted. They lived on their own terms against impossible odds. So tonight, when you crawl into your clean bed with your indoor plumbing, your antibiotics, and your central heating, maybe take a second to appreciate it. Because history isn't just a story. It's a reminder that comfort is a luxury, and survival has always been an act of defiance. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, drop a comment and let me know which story hit hardest, and I'll see you in the next one.